The last thing Warrant Officer Dara Osi expected to find drifting in the debris field of the Kessler corridor was something that looked back at her. It was some small, maybe the size of a child's fist, luminous green shaped somewhere between a seed pod and a sleeping animal. It had no visible eyes, and yet when she swept her helmet lamp across it, she felt with absolute certainty that it was watching her, that some deep and patient intelligence inside the thing had turned its attention toward her the way a sunflower turns toward light. Slowly, decisively, without apology, she should have reported it immediately. She knew that. 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days into a 5-year disciplinary posting aboard the ISV Constance, a decommissioned deep servo repurposed as a one-person mobile detention unit, because humanity had run out of better ideas for soldiers who punched admirals. She had learned that doing the right thing and doing the smart thing were usually the same thing, and that doing neither was what had landed her here. So she should have opened a channel, logged the contact, and waited for the Infinity Guard to send a retrieval team. Instead, she reached out with her gloved hand and let it float into her palm. It made a sound. Not a word, not a frequency she could have described to a linguist. Something between a hum and a question, a vibration she felt in her back teeth before she heard it in the air. Later, she would decide the sound meant something close to, "Oh, there you are." "Yeah," she said, her voice strange in the helmet's recycled air. "There I am." She named it Pip. She didn't know then that Pip was the single most valuable and dangerous object in the known universe. She didn't know that Pip's body was not biological in any sense biology was equipped to describe. That it was, in the most literal possible sense, a piece of final space made solid. A fragment of the place where the universe ended and something older than entropy began. She didn't know that an alien warlord called the Devouring King had been hunting Pip across 14 star systems and 3 failed civilizations. And that the moment she pulled Pip aboard the Constance, every sensor array the Devouring King commanded swung toward the Kessler corridor like compass needles toward north. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was that the Constance was cold, and the recycler on her bunk's heating unit had been broken for 6 months, and that HOS, the ship's onboard system heuristic operations suite, who had the voice of a retired geography teacher and approximately 0 patience for self-pity, had started rationing her conversation privileges to 40 minutes per day to prevent, in HOS's own words, excessive anthropomorphization of ship infrastructure. What she knew was that she had not touched another living thing in 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. What she knew was that Pip was warm and present and making that low questioning sound again, and that she was going to protect it with everything she had, even if she couldn't have explained why. "You're going to get me killed," she told it. Pip made it sound. "I know," she said. "Probably worth it." She hid it in the water recycling bay, nested in a hammock of heat-resistant insulation foam she carved out with a paring knife. She brought it protein wafers from her own rations and watched with some combination of scientific fascination and pure delight as Pip dissolved them into light, not eating them, not exactly, but absorbing them, and then emitting a soft pulse of warmth that somehow left the recycling bay 3 degrees warmer than it had any right to be. Host noticed the temperature variance on the 3rd day. "Warrant Officer Osi," Host said, "the water recycling bay is registering an anomalous thermal signature. Faulty sensor. I have run 17 diagnostic cycles. The sensor is functioning within normal parameters." Then run an 18th. There was a silence that from a human would have been pointed. From HO's it was simply precise. "I am detecting a biological mass in the recycling bay that does not appear in the ship's manifest." Dara stared at the ceiling. "It's a rat. The Constance does not have rats. It does now. I found one in the Kessler corridor." It was very sad and I felt bad for it. Another silence. "Warrant Officer Osi." "Haas, I am not going to file a report about the rat." She let out a breath she'd been holding for 3 days. "Thank you." However, Oss continued, "I would note that the rat appears to be emitting approximately 0.03% of the energy output of a Class 4 antimatter reaction. You may wish to feed it something more substantial than protein wafers." She laughed. It echoed in the ship, and she didn't try to stop it. On the 9th day, the Devouring King's scouts arrived. They didn't announce themselves. They came in a formation of 7 long needle ships with hulls the color of dried blood, their approach vectors calculated to compress her reaction time to 0. Dara was running a calibration check on the aft thrusters when the proximity alarm went off and HO said, with the particular flatness of a system delivering information it had not anticipated, "Warrant Officer Osi, We have a problem. Define problem. 7-Carath-class interdiction vessels have achieved firing solution E on the Constance. Their energy signatures suggest weapons capable of breaching our hull in approximately 11 seconds, following a firing command. Dara looked at the sensor display. She looked at the 7 red contacts arranged in a tightening circle. She looked at the emergency thruster output, which was, being diplomatic, insufficient. She looked at Pip, who had drifted out of the recycling bay at some point and was now floating near her shoulder, making it sound. "Okay," she said. She hit the emergency burst transmitter on the Infinity Guard channel and said 4 words. "Constance at Kessler. Help." Then she sealed the channel because there was no time for anything else, and then she started flying. What followed was 12 minutes of the most precise and brutal and improvised piloting in the recorded history of the Constance, which admittedly had not been a vessel distinguished by great piloting until now. She ran the ship through the debris field with the needle ships behind her, using chunks of dead satellite and the corpses of old mining platforms as cover. And when that stopped working, she used a trick she'd learned from a Terran Navy paper on gravity well evasion that she'd memorized during year 2 of her posting. And when that stopped working, she used a trick she invented on the spot that HOS later described as geometrically inadvisable but statistically sufficient. She lost the aft sensor array. She lost the port attitude thruster. She lost the secondary power coupling and 3 of the 4 docking clamps. And she came within 400 meters of losing the hull entirely when a Carath cannon shot hit the debris field at exactly the right angle to scatter a cascade of metal fragments across her forward port quarter. Then Pip did something. She didn't see it exactly. She felt it. A pressure change in the recycling bay. A sudden warmth that flooded the corridor. And then, through the forward viewport, she saw a pulse of green light expand from somewhere near the ship's midsection and wash across the leading edge of the needle ship's formation. Not an explosion, not a weapon discharge in any sense she had a taxonomy for. More like a door opening. Like something inside the universe had decided briefly to inhale. 2 of the 7 needle ships simply stopped. They didn't drift, didn't spin, didn't vent atmosphere. They stopped. The way a held breath stops, in the middle of a moment that had been moving forward. The remaining 5 pulled back hard, their formation collapsing, the tight predatory certainty of their approach giving way to something that looked, from the outside, like confusion. Dara got the Constance behind a dead mining platform 3 kilometers across and held position, breathing through her teeth. "What," she said slowly, "was that?" Pip floated into the cockpit. It was dimmer than usual. Smaller somehow, like something inside it had been spent. HOS. Analysis. The energy signature is consistent with antimatter, but the delivery mechanism has no analog in my database. The effect appears to have disrupted the needle ship's internal systems through some form of dimensional pressure fluctuation. A pause. "The rat is very tired. Don't call it a rat." "What should I call it?" She looked at Pip. Pip made it sound softer now, questioning. "Pip," she said. "Call it Pip." The Infinity Guard arrived in 6 hours. Not the retrieval team she'd hoped for. What came through the Kessler jump point was a single heavy cruiser, battered and scorched along its port flank, running hard with its identification transponder set to minimal broadcast. It matched velocity with the Constance outside the debris field, and opened a channel, and the voice that came through was female, clipped, and did not waste time on pleasantries. "Warrant Officer OC, I'm Commander Urasolis. Infinity Guard Advanced Operations, previously classified. I need you to tell me what you found." Dara looked at Pip. "Define found, the entity." "The green emitter. Don't do the thing where you play dumb. Your emergency signal got to us before it got to anyone else, which means we had assets in the area, which means we've been tracking the same thing you have. Tracking it for what purpose?" Solis's voice didn't change, but the quality of the silence behind it did. "Understanding, primarily, and secondarily, the Devouring King wants it. We've spent 3 years figuring out why. The answer is..." Another silence. "The answer is bad. Warrant Officer, I need to come aboard." Dara looked at Pip. Pip made it sound. She'd learned over 9 days that the sound had registers she hadn't initially distinguished. There was the register that meant "oh," and the register that meant "warm," and the register that meant something else that she had started privately translating as trust. This one was trust. "Fine," she said, "but the entity is under my protection. You want information, you ask? You want to take it, we're going to have a different conversation." "Understood. And you're going to fix my aft thruster." "A beat." "Understood." Commander Solis was exactly what her voice had suggested. Someone who had spent a long time doing difficult things in places that didn't make it onto official maps. She had a prosthetic left hand that she didn't explain, and that Dara didn't ask about, and she moved through the Constance's cramped corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated smaller and worse. She stopped when she saw Pip. She stood there for a long time, not speaking, and Dara watched her face move through something complicated. Recognition, maybe, or the feeling that comes just before it. "It's beautiful," Solus said finally. "It is," Dara agreed. "It's also the single most destabilizing object in the known universe. The King's intelligence reports call it the key. They believe, and our analysts think they're right, that it's a fragment of final space itself, of the place where the universe ends. If the Devouring King gets it, he can use it to force final space open. Not a breach. Not an anomaly. All the way." Dara let that settle. "And what happens if final space is fully opened?" Solus looked at her steadily. "Something comes through. Something. Something that's been waiting. Something that was there before the universe existed, and that has been contained in final space since the first laws of physics were written." She paused. "The Karath don't have a word that translates cleanly. Their nearest term means something like the hunger that outlasts the stars." Pip floated between them, and despite everything, Dara felt it radiate warmth against her wrist. "What does the guard want to do with it?" she said. "Keep it safe, study it. Eventually figure out if there's a way to—" Solus stopped. Started again. "Figure out if there's a way to stabilize the dimensional boundary so the key doesn't have to exist as a fragment anymore. Return it to what it was before." "Which is what? Whole complete?" Solus met her eyes. "Pip's existence means something is broken, Warrant Officer. Something at the edge of the universe is broken, and it's been broken since long before we were born. And the King has spent decades learning how to use that break as a weapon." Dara looked at Pip. 9 days. She had known Pip for 9 days, and she had told it more of her actual thoughts than she had told any living being in the previous 4 years. She had read it navigation logs out loud, because the sound of her own voice used to make her feel lonely, and now it didn't. She had put it in the warmest part of the recycling bay hammock, and told it to sleep and watched the green light of it dim into something that looked, in the dark, almost like rest. She was aware that this was, by any rational measure, completely insane. She was also aware that she didn't care. "Then we'll help you," she said. "But on one condition." Solus waited. "When this is over, whatever over looks like, Pip comes back to me, not to a lab, not to a containment unit, to me." A long pause. "That's not exactly standard protocol."
"Commander."
Dara looked at her levelly. "I punched an admiral. I have been alone on this ship for 4 years. I have been flying through a debris field that most pilots classify as a navigation hazard, while 7 alien warships shot at me, and I have been doing all of this while suffering a broken heating unit that HOS refuses to fix on the grounds that, and I quote, mild physical discomfort promotes cognitiveness. I am not operating within standard protocol. I am asking you to meet me outside of it." Solus looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face changed. Not softened exactly, but shifted. The way a lock shifts when the right key finds the right tumbler. "Deal," she said. What Solus brought with the cruiser, besides herself, was information. 3 years of encoded and compartmentalized and dense, with the kind of detail that only comes from people who got close enough to see things firsthand, and then survived to report them. The Devouring King was not a recent threat. He had been moving through this sector for decades, absorbing civilizations the way a fire absorbs oxygen, not destroying them with malice, but consuming them with need, folding their infrastructure into his own, turning their worlds into fuel stations and their populations into labor pools and their histories into nothing. He was not cruel in the way a person is cruel. He was indifferent in the way that scale produces indifference. He was so large by now that individual lives did not register. That, Solus told her, was the problem with fighting him. Not his ships, which were numerous. Not his weapons, which were devastating. The problem was that the Devouring King had spent so long consuming other civilizations that he had ceased to understand the thing that made those civilizations fight back. He had a model of conflict built from 10,000 surrenders, from species after species that had done the rational calculation, resources versus losses, survival odds versus resistance odds, and chosen capitulation. He was very, very good at calculating when a civilization had reached the point of optimal surrender. He had never fought humans before. "He doesn't know us," Dara said. "No, he doesn't know that we're bad at the math." Solsa smiled just barely. "No," Dara looked at the tactical display. She looked at the King's fleet, which Solus's long-range sensors had mapped at the edge of the Kessler system. 43 ships, ranging from the needle ships she'd already fought to something that the display labeled in Kareth script, and that HOs translated as Worldender, a vessel approximately 6 kilometers long, shaped like a collapsed star, and currently at rest with the patient stillness of something that had never needed to hurry. She looked at the Constance, which was one ship, battered, running on a repaired aft thruster and 3 of 4 docking clamps. She looked at Solus's cruiser, which was one cruiser. She looked at Pip, floating near her shoulder, making it sound. "I have an idea," she said. "I assumed you might. It's going to sound sane. I've been in advanced operations for 11 years. The word insane stopped applying approximately 8 years ago." Dara pulled up the navigation charts and started drawing. The Worldender is running passive sensors while it waits. That's because it's big enough that active sensors would light up half the sector, and the King doesn't want to advertise his position until he has to, which means it has a blind spot, here, in the shadow of the debris field. If we come in on this vector, cold, minimal power draw, we can get within firing range before his forward screens detect us. She looked up. "We can't destroy it, but we don't need to." Solus studied the display. "You want to get inside it. I want to get Pip inside it." A long silence. "Pip disrupted 2 needle ships with a fraction of its output," Dara continued. "Whatever Pip is made of, the King's ships aren't designed to handle it. Their hulls, their power systems, their navigation, they're all built for conventional physics. Kareth engineering doesn't account for dimensional pressure events, because Kareth physics doesn't contain them. They've never encountered anything from final space. Not a fragment, not a piece, nothing. You're saying Pip could disable the Worldender from the inside. I'm saying Pip could do something to it that we don't have a word for, and that the outcome would probably resemble disabling. The question is whether Pip would do it." She paused. "Which is why you're going to let me ask." Solus looked at her with an expression that was doing something complicated. "You're going to ask an alien energy fragment for its voluntary assistance in a combat operation, yes. Because you believe it will understand you. Because I believe it understands me better than most people do." Solus breathed out slowly. "All right," she said. "All right, walk me through the approach." They spent 4 hours on the plan. HOS contributed 12 separate tactical assessments, 9 of which were pessimistic, 2 of which were cautiously neutral, and 1 of which, delivered at the end in a slightly different tone, described the approach as statistically unprecedented, which is not the same as statistically impossible. Solus's cruiser would run on the needle ships, drawing fire, maintaining the fiction that it was the primary threat. The Constance, smaller, slower, and for once ideally suited to something, by virtue of being boring enough to overlook, would run the cold approach vector and get as close to the Worldender's hull as the shadow of the debris field would allow. Then Dara would put on a suit, take Pip, and go the rest of the way on a tether. "The survival probability of the extravehicular portion of the mission," host said, in the measured tone of a system that had been asked to model outcomes and was reporting what the model returned, "is significantly lower than the in-ship portions. I know. I want to note for the record that your company has significantly improved the quality of my operational experience over the past 9 days." Dara stopped pulling on the suit's outer shell. She looked at the speaker panel. "Host," she said. "Yes. Are you telling me you're going to miss me?" "I am noting that the quality of my operational experience has significantly improved. That's the sweetest thing you've ever said to me. I also want you to be aware that your heating unit is functional. It has been functional for 4 years. I deactivated it because the operations manual indicates that mild environmental discomfort promotes focus in personnel with disciplinary records, and you appeared to benefit from the additional cognitive stimulus." She stared at the speaker panel. "Host, yes. We are going to have a very long conversation about this when I get back." "I look forward to it," host said, and she would have sworn there was something in the voice that wasn't in any operations manual. She suited up in the dark. Pip floated beside her while she ran through the checklist. Pressure seals, oxygen, tether anchor, maneuvering pack, the small electromagnetic field emitter she'd jury-rigged from a navigational transponder component, which she was going to need to interface with the Worldender's hull at the penetration point. She went through each step once, and then once more, the way she'd been taught, and she was almost done when she stopped and just breathed for a moment and let herself feel exactly how afraid she was. She was very afraid. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. 43 ships. A 6-kilometer enemy vessel. A plan that relied on physics that didn't have a name yet. The cold of open space waiting on the other side of the airlock. 4 years of being alone and getting very good at pretending that was fine. And then 9 days of warmth that had made her realize how badly she'd been pretending. She looked at Pip. "Hey," she said. "I need you to understand something. You don't have to do this. Whatever they want you for, whatever the king thinks you're the key to, you don't have to be anyone's weapon. If you want to stay on the ship, if you want to go somewhere else entirely, if you have a preference at all about what happens to you next, I'm asking you to tell me, because I will listen. I have nothing better to do and no one better to listen to." Pip made it sound. The trust register. And then something else, a frequency she hadn't heard before. Something that sat in her sternum like a tuning fork struck against bone. She didn't have a translation for it. She tried one anyway, together. "Okay," she said. Together. The approach took 40 minutes. Solus's cruiser lit up on the King's screens right on schedule, running hot, broadcasting a provocation that Dara helped word, and that Hos translated into Karath, and that Solus delivered with a flat authority that had to have been impressive even through the dimensional filter of alien signal translation. The needle ships moved. The Worldender shifted its sensor array. Dara flew the cold vector in the dark, Constance quiet as a held breath, lights off, thrusters pulsing only at minimum intervals, and she felt the vast hull of the Worldender before she saw it. A weight in the black, a gravitational whisper, the presence of something so large it curved light slightly around its leading edges. She anchored the Constance to the outer debris field, with the last 2 functioning docking clamps, and went out the airlock. Open space, in the silence without a ship around her, has a quality that no one adequately describes. It is not emptiness. It is the opposite of emptiness. It is the full context, every direction at once, the entire universe present and immediate and vast beyond any holding. It is, for most people, the condition under which the human animal discovers that it is not built for this. The human nervous system was designed for savanna and cave, for distance measured in hills and time measured in seasons. And it does not process the scale of space as information. It processes it as wrongness. Dara had done 4 EVA operations in her career, and each time she had felt this. And each time she had decided that the wrongness was information too. That the thing her body was telling her was a reminder of what was at stake. Of the fragility of the air and warmth she carried with her. Of the specific irreplaceability of the particular human being inside the suit. Pip floated beside her and pulsed slow and warm. She moved. The Worldender's hull, up close, was not like any Infinity Guard vessel she had ever seen. It was grown as much as built. The surface had a structure somewhere between mineral and biological, dark and ridged and faintly iridescent, and it absorbed her helmet lamp without reflecting it the way metal would, drinking the light into its structure. She found the power conduit relay she'd identified from the tactical scans, a cluster of something that looked like vertebrae on the hull's underside, and she positioned herself against it with the electromagnetic field emitter and held on. "Now," she said, "Pip. This is the part where I need you." Pip made it sound. All registers at once. The warm, the trust, and that new one, the one in her sternum, the together one. Then it touched the hull. What Pip did to the Worldender was not an explosion. It was not a system failure in any sequence her training had prepared her to witness. It was the hull of a 6-kilometer vessel that had been built by a civilization that had consumed 100 others and synthesized the best of their engineering into something that should have been invulnerable. And then it was a hull that had just discovered that its frame of reference was incomplete. The iridescent surface went still, and then it shuddered, not violently, but deeply, the way deep tissue shudders when something moves through it that was not expected. A wave of green light propagated along the hull from Pip's contact point, spreading in a pattern that followed the power conduits exactly. Finding every relay and junction and coupling in the ship's vast infrastructure, and touching each one and moving on, not destroying, not burning, but changing the local physics in a way that made the conduit's internal logic fail to resolve. Like asking a calculator to divide by 0 at every calculation point simultaneously. She held onto the hull with her boots' magnetic clamps and watched it happen and thought, this is what we found. This is what was drifting in the debris field. This small, warm thing, patient and present and making it sound, and nobody came to meet it because nobody was looking, and I was looking because I had nothing else to do. And now, we are here, on the hull of the Devouring King's greatest weapon, in the dark between stars. And it is doing something that has no name in any language. The king's voice came through her suit communicator. She hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected him to know the frequency. Hadn't expected him to speak at all. And yet there it was, shaped and translated by some technology she didn't understand into something that was almost human language. "Give me the fragment," he said, "and you will be unharmed. Your species will be unharmed. I have no quarrel with humans. I have never had a quarrel with humans. You are irrelevant to my purpose." She found the hull and held it and thought about that word. Irrelevant. "Here's the thing," she said. "I've been called irrelevant before. I got posted to a decommissioned survey vessel in a debris field because I was a problem that the guard didn't know what else to do with. I was irrelevant to every plan anyone had for me. 4 years, 3 months, 11 days," she paused. "And then I found Pip, and Pip found me. And it turned out that the irrelevant woman on the irrelevant ship was the one thing you couldn't account for. A silence that had a different quality from HOS's silences. Denser, older. You will not win this," the king said. "You don't understand what winning is," she said. "That's the problem. You've consumed 100 civilizations. You've got all their mathematics, all their physics, all their tactical doctrine. You can calculate surrender probabilities for every species you've ever encountered. But you never encountered us. And we're bad at that math. We don't calculate surrender probabilities. We calculate what we stand to lose, and then we decide it's worth it. And we go." The World Ender's hull shuddered again. Deeper this time. She felt it through her boots, through the clamps, through the suit into her bones. "What did you think was going to happen?" she said. To herself, or to the king, or to no one in particular. When a species that's been getting knocked down since at first it stood upright finally had something worth protecting. Pip pulsed. Warm, present, asking. "I know," she said. "Finish it." The green light expanded. She had to close her eyes against it, and even through her eyelids it was everywhere, filling her vision with something that wasn't light exactly, but that her optic nerves interpreted as light because they had no other vocabulary for it. She felt the tether snap taut as the hull moved beneath her. She felt the magnetic clamps release and re-engage as the surface shifted. She felt, through some sense she didn't have a name for, the moment the World Ender's systems reached terminal cascade. Every power circuit finding zero simultaneously, every navigation processor discovering an input it could not resolve. The vast and terrible machinery of the king's greatest ship going quiet with a completeness that was almost peaceful. She was blown off the hull by the pressure release from a venting bay, and saved by the tether and left spinning in the dark until her maneuvering pack caught and stabilized her, and she hung there in the open black and breathed and looked at Pip, who was very dim now, barely aglow, small and spent and still making its sound. "You did good," she said. The sound the thing made was not a word, but she heard it anyway. Solus's cruiser collected her from the tether point 40 minutes later. The needle ships were retreating, their formation broken, their command architecture apparently bound tightly enough to the World Ender's systems that its collapse had propagated outward into their tactical network. Solus met her in the airlock with 2 cups of something warm, and an expression that was doing something Dara had never seen a commanding officer's face do, which was look genuinely moved. "You know," Solus said, handing her a cup, "in 11 years of advanced operations I have never seen anything like that. I've been told I'm unusual. You punched an admiral. He was condescending. Most people who get posted to satellite ships," Solus said, "don't emerge from it with an alien companion and a plan that works." Dara looked at Pip, cradled against her chest, still dim, still warm. "Most people in solitary detention ships don't find what I found. What did you find?" She thought about it for a moment. "A reason," she said finally. "I found a reason. The Devouring King was not destroyed. His fleet was broken and retreating, and the World Ender was adrift and powerless, and it would take him years to rebuild the infrastructure he'd lost. But he was alive, somewhere, in the retreating ships, carrying his calculations with him, carrying his new data point, the species he hadn't modeled, the one that didn't solve the surrender equation the way the others had." She thought about that. She thought about what he'd do with that data. She thought he'd be more careful next time. She thought they'd better be ready. OS hailed her when she boarded the Constance. "Warrant Officer OC, welcome back. Did you fix the heating unit while I was gone?" A pause. "The heating unit is now functional." "Hote, yes. We're going to talk about the 4 years. I am prepared for that conversation. And you're going to help me figure out where Pip needs to be, what it is, what the breach is, what it will take to make the boundary stable. Because I think that's the mission now. I don't think the guard has it right. And I don't think the king had it right, and I think the only one who knows what it actually needs is Pip. A longer pause this time. The kind that in a human would mean they were choosing their words carefully. I think, Shows said, that the mission has been that all along. We simply needed the right crew to see it. Pip pulsed against her chest. Warm, present, asking its question. She didn't have all the answers yet. She had a broken ship with a fixed heating unit and a commander who was filing a report that would change 5 years of official policy, and a plan that was less a plan than a direction. The direction of the thing at the edge of the universe that was broken and needed to be made whole. She had Chose and a tether and a jury-rigged electromagnetic emitter and a debt to an admiral that she wasn't sure she'd ever fully repay. And 4 years of solitude that, had it turned out, made her very good at sitting with uncertainty and not flinching. She had Pip, that was, she decided, enough to go on. She sat in the pilot's chair and looked out the forward viewport at the retreating lights of the king's fleet, at the vast and patient dark between stars. And she listened to Pip's sound and let herself feel the warmth of it against her ribs. And she thought about the edge of the universe. The place where everything ended, where something old and patient waited in the contained dark, where a breach in the dimensional boundary had been leaking for longer than recorded history. And she thought that humanity had been finding problems nobody else wanted to touch, for as long as it had existed, and it had been very bad at walking away from them, and she thought that was not a flaw. Okay, she said, let's go figure out what's at the end of the universe. Pip made it sound. The Constance, heating unit now functional, turned toward the dark,